Hello everyone and welcome to CCM Connect. This week we have Jesse with us and myself, Zach, to talk about the beginnings of Jesse's faith journey. But before that, we need to start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
God, thank you for bringing me and Jesse here. I pray that anyone watching this gets the message that they need from it. And I pray that we have a good and thoughtful conversation. Amen. Alright, so Jesse, let's start. I want to ask you about your beginnings in your faith background and basically the household.
Okay. So looking back, my mother early on, was probably the only kind of spiritual or religious person in our house. She grew up Methodist and was pretty faithful to that. My father was raised, nominally Lutheran. Wasn't very religious really early on in my childhood. Well, I know myself and my brother, not long after we were born, we were baptized in the Methodist Church. We occasionally attended there. If we did ever attend church, it was at the Methodist Church that my mother grew up near my grandparents' home. So if we were visiting or something, occasionally we would visit there. But we really didn't go to church that often. We didn't really do any sort of religious practice very often, occasionally say grace before meals or something like that, like on Christmas or Easter, nothing really special. And occasionally I know that, I might go with my aunt or some friends to a service, and whenever we went, it was always a Baptist church, Southern Baptist, Independent, whatever. But that wasn't very often. It wasn't until I was probably about 8 years old, maybe 9, that my mother started attending a local Southern Baptist congregation. And she would bring me along, and I think at that point my brother was probably old enough that he was working, and my dad didn't go with us. So we attended there for quite a while. Pretty regularly, and then my brother started participating with a youth group at another local Southern Baptist church, and at some point during his experience there, he had a saved experience with that youth group and started attending church there, and so my mother thought it would be a good idea if she started attending that church as well, so we started going there. And eventually, through some difficult circumstances, we all ended up attending that church. Me, my mother, my brother, and my father. And we were actually, I think we were all baptized at least a second time at that church, which, as you know, and as I later found out, is not exactly how things are supposed to be done. But yeah, my parents still go there. My brother attended church there until he moved away. He was probably around 22, I would guess, and then I stopped attending around 18 or so. Yeah.
So let me first, after that, ask about what sort of interested you into wanting to learn more about the Catholic Church. Like, when did you start thinking about that more? And what made you think that way?
So probably, I guess in my early teen years, I started becoming really interested in, I was just taking all the time I could. I was reading and studying things on the internet because, at school we had a lot of online classes. There was a lot of downtime. So I was always researching and reading about things. And, I'm the kind of person who I like to know the origins of something. I like to know the story, the history of something. And I became really kind of enamored with the United Kingdom and English history, and of course through that it's inevitable that you discover the Church of England, which is the official church in the United Kingdom. And in looking at the history, learning about Henry VIII and breaking from the church because he was wanting a divorce with his wife and all of that, you start to discover that, well, then it's not really that far from Catholicism, and that's what it separated from. And, I started reading about Anglicanism and Anglican teaching and, watching Anglican services and sometimes Anglican music. And, I really became enamored with, these very thorough and traditional liturgical practices and the vestments and the feast days. And it was kind of foreign to me that there is a set liturgy and that this is the way things are done, and people across, the United Kingdom or across the Church of England are having the same readings every day. But like I said, eventually, you start to discover, well, it all just traces back to the Catholic Church. It's just historic fact that the Catholic Church is the first church. And, when you look at, the Church of England, so the Church of England started in the mid, 16th century. Well, when you look at, even with the Baptist Church, at best, they get in the middle of the 17th century, so maybe 350 years. And then Catholicism has 2,000 years,
I think that attracts a lot of people, the sort of tradition of the Catholic Church. And the fact that you can trace it all the way back to that, even with even looking at the popes, and tracing it all the way back to Peter, or just the tradition of what we actually do during Mass and how the sacraments are celebrated and things of that nature. So let me ask you what sort of made you decide that you wanted to what was the moment where you decided that you wanted to convert, and what led up to that moment?
So I think it's a long process, and the earliest thing I know in this was, of course, I had what I would have called or what I would now call a conversion experience at that Baptist church when I was about 10. And of course, in the Baptist tradition, you call it getting saved. There's the belief of if you say a prayer to Jesus and you say, well, I give my heart to you, or I'm sorry for my sins, or whatever, from that point you're good. From that point you go to heaven. And I had that experience, and I went up to the altar with the minister and said that prayer. And after that, it's actually when I was baptized for the second time. And I remember really clearly on that Sunday, we were celebrating what they call Coronation Sunday, and it's a day where you celebrate crowning Jesus as King or Prince. And they actually don't practice that anymore. And my assumption is that that's not practiced because it's actually
more traditional.
Yeah, it looks a little too Catholic. The minister was dressed in a robe, and the choir was wearing robes, and there was a procession with music and banners, and I think that was probably the first notice of the direction I was going to be going, because it's not just inherent to me, but I think it's inherent to everyone else that if you have a more physical symbol or more physical resemblance of the faith, that's going to be attractive. And so in the higher church practices, and especially, looking at the Catholic Church, I couldn't deny that the Catholic Church was the original church, and that the Catholic Church was the true church. So started learning about their practices more. And I know, the first Mass I went to, I was like 5. And I think it was at a relative's wedding. And I just remember being absolutely bored. And I didn't know what was going on, wondering when that was going to end. Just because I couldn't appreciate it at that point. And then at about 16, of course, after I've been doing all this studying and thinking and reflecting, I got my driver's license, and one of the first things that I wanted to do was go to a Sunday Mass. So I met a friend at Sunday Mass, local parish, 8 o'clock in the morning. And it wasn't disappointing.
Yeah.
You know, because everything that I had been learning about was basically playing out before me. And it was just sort of like confirmation of, yes, this is what it teaches that it is. You know, sometimes we can, you know, not to compare it in value, but say we go to a movie that's just come out and we hear these great things about what the movie's going to be like and blah, 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 and we go to the movie theater. We're really disappointed because it's not what it teaches. It's not what it says it is, but that's not true with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is what it teaches.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was like, okay, so this is, I mean, undoubtedly, this is the direction I'm going. And for the next couple of years, it was kind of difficult because there wasn't outright criticism of me wanting to become Catholic, but there was definitely a little bit of pushback or discomfort, you know, amongst family and friends and that sort of thing. And there was an inwardly discomfort too, because, you know, I'd been with this congregation for, you know, nearly 10 years as a young kid, and you know, forming strong bonds and relationships with people there, and just the normality of it as well. But eventually, I believe it was around 2018, well no, actually the end of 2017, I stopped attending Baptist services altogether. I was attending Mass and both services actually, off and on for quite a bit before, but it was at the end of the 2018 that I stopped attending Baptist services and started going to Mass regularly, and I didn't start RCIA until I think July of 2019, so several months of just attending Mass. And I think, you know, for me that was really important to just sort of establish that foundation.
Yeah.
And just have, okay, so this is what this is about. Things are becoming familiar. Things are becoming solid. So I started RCIA, went through RCIA, and then I was confirmed, received First Communion, First Eucharist, brought into the church, Easter Vigil of 2019.
I think it's the familiarity of the Catholic Church that I find comforting. I mean, growing up Catholic for me was, we always spent time in different parishes because moving around a lot, and what was always the same, or at least close enough, was the fact that we went to church on Sundays, and it was always it's the same reading no matter what church you're at every day. It's the same readings that you do. Everyone does their masses a little bit differently, but it's still the same concrete ideas that come from that tradition that we were talking about. And it's just like, and like you were saying, like if you get more familiar to it, it becomes more comforting and
and you kind of internalize it.
Yeah, more of like what this is, whereas you don't really have to like find the church that's right for you. Just the church is there wherever you go. And you mentioned RCIA. Can you talk about any time or point in RCIA where you felt like some sort of pushback or conflict within yourself about the decision you had made, or was there any doubt in there?
I mean, by the time I had started RCIA, you know, I'd been looking at the church for so long, and you know, reading through the catechism and reading through the scriptures, and you know, when you go through RCIA, it's really the basics, and I really had the bases covered by the time I started RCIA, and so a lot of I mean, I guess there was nerves, I guess you could say, or a little bit of nervousness in RCIA, because then your decision's very real. You're leading up to that point where, you know, if you follow through everything, it really is going to change the course of your life.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, it's a big decision.
Even if it's not like doubt, it's just like you're saying, that it's a huge decision. Any kind of like big commitment can always come with anxiety or some kind of nervousness, because this is actually an ultimate change you're making to your life.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, any doubt really, I think I dealt with pretty well before it. And I think, like you're saying, growing that familiar and internalizing with the Mass and the practice and saying rosaries and saying the Divine Mercy and making the sign of the cross, because that's, you don't do that in the Baptist tradition. I think that helped a lot to kind of take care of any doubt.
And just like doing what you can to get yourself ready, or just familiarize yourself. Just when you're curious, not being afraid to ask questions or research it on your own, because I think ultimately a lot of, at least from what I've witnessed, a lot of people who I've known that have converted to the faith, to my faith, or our faith, our faith, have come from places that didn't really involve, a lot of tradition, and have also came because they realized they actually did some reading and they researched it a little bit, and they find what the truth really is, and that leads them to the Catholic Church. And I've always found that comforting.
Yeah, well, and like you were saying earlier too about like, we all have the same readings, or the practice is the same at every Mass essentially, and it's, I know so many people, evangelical friends, when they move or whatever, it's really stressful for them trying to find a new church, because evangelical churches, Baptist churches, this church on this end of the block and this church on this end, they may call themselves Baptist, but one, for all we know, could have a female minister, and this church down the street could absolutely just, they wouldn't even dream of that. Or, there could be little beliefs about what you wear, or what you listen to, or what you eat, or what you drink, or whatever. And no doubt, no matter what church you go to, the sermon's going to be different. And just one of the attractive things about the church, and I think it just speaks to the truth of Catholicism, is there is this deep unity. Because, if people were to go to Mass today, they're going to be hearing essentially the same readings. And there's this idea that develops, or you become familiar with, of everyone in the church is essentially growing at the same time. They're hearing the same things, and there's this great spirit of fraternity. And something Jesus stresses throughout the gospel is this unity of people staying together and following Him. And I think the way that the Catholic Church does that, it should really speak to people. And I think it especially speaks to people, like you say, coming from places that have a lack of tradition, or really that lack of unity with other congregations.
You mentioned unity. I also think of when you were talking, I was reminded the word Catholic actually means universal. So it's a universal church, like you're saying. Like with other denominations, you might have two churches that are close together, and identified as the same, but are very different. But with the Catholic Church, you have churches all over the globe that all follow the same concrete set of rules that came from tradition, that were founded hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Well, and then too, it's like, and then people will say, well, where's your diversity or whatever? Well, think about all the different rites.
Yeah.
There's ordinariate rites for Anglicans. There are Byzantine rites and Greek rites and Marianite, and I think there's even an Egyptian. There are so many different rites, and each church, wherever they are, they're respective of the language, they're respective of the culture. So I think the Catholic Church is also special in that it embraces cultural diversity, but then again, it also teaches that unity, or focuses on unity of having the same sort of practices.
You mentioned diversity. That actually makes me think. You were talking about cultural diversity, and that brings to me just like the general diversity. If you look inside of just one rite or one group of Catholics, there's so many different ways to be Catholic. There's so many different things that you can choose to be interested in as a Catholic. You can, like, for me personally, I like to read about the saints and to look at the kind of lives that they've lived. Or you could also just like daily prayer or can't think of the word now. Like evening prayer, morning prayer.
Right, yeah.
You could be someone who does that. You could pray rosary all the time. You could, and obviously like a priest is a very different Catholic than someone like you or me.
Right.
So there's just that kind of diversity and like different personalities and everything. Well, that's what I think of when I think of universality of the church.
Yeah, and it speaks to, I think, of course the church is an institution we're very familiar with, the hierarchy, the bishops and the priests and all that. But the church really is this home.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily a physical, like, CCM doesn't just represent the church, or this home as a building. The home is connected, like you say, through this diversity and this endless resources of faith. All of the chaplets, all of the devotions and the saints are just a plethora of knowledge and types of spirituality that can fit so many different people. And that just reminds me of a home, because a home should be a place where all are welcome and everyone is treated the same way, but then they're also respected in how they learn best or how they connect with God, and that's just what the church provides.
And you bringing it back to focus more on about people that are curious about the faith. You mentioned CCM and like the church being a home, and to me CCM is like a home for people who are Catholics here at Western, and you can just pop in and say hi to someone or talk to Deacon if you have questions. Or talk to anyone if you have questions.
Yeah.
Like, we'd all be willing to, with our best knowledge, answer them.
And it's been a home for non-Catholics. I know
exactly.
For the little time that I've been here, there's been several non-Catholics that are here pretty regularly.
Yeah. Again, it's a universal church. We accept anyone who's willing to come say hi, and if whatever kind of person.
Exactly.
So, what other kind of advice would you have for someone who might be thinking about the faith?
The best thing that I can speak to, especially at our age right now, where you're a young adult and you're kind of working your thing out, and you're in charge essentially. I think first and foremost, go somewhere that's comfortable for you and start to learn. The great thing about CCM is maybe you're not comfortable with coming to Mass yet. We come to Credo. Listen to our Wednesday night programs. And I think, yes, do go to Mass. And if you don't really know much about the Mass, it can be really daunting if you just show up and you're not really sure what's going on. But yeah, just kind of educate yourself a little bit. Take the initiative to read a little bit and learn. And I think the more that we learn intellectually, and then also the more that we learn in practice, both of those will start to come together. And I think that where, this intellectual idea and practice, that's sort of where we find our spirituality, is where those two meet. So I think if you do both of those things, that you'll be putting yourself on the right path.
I think we'll end it there.
Okay.
Jess, thanks for coming and talking with me.
Had a good time.
We had a good conversation. With that, I'll close this in prayer.
Okay.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God, thank you for bringing me and Jess here together. Thank you for the wonderful conversation that we had. I'd like to pray for anyone who might be curious about the faith, that they are not afraid to ask questions or afraid to acknowledge this curiosity and move on with whatever step they would like to make. And I pray that you guide them safely into your arms. Amen. Okay, now before we go, if you're watching this video on the day that it premieres, at 8 o'clock we will be live streaming adoration, and this is a perfect opportunity for you to start praying more and just to sort of meditate in the presence of of Jesus in the form of the Eucharist. So with that, we will see you guys at 8 or next week with our new video.
All right.